Okay, and I'll try and read it as such. How would you bring back the oil and gas business that left our state back to New Mexico? Exclamation point towards the end there. And this question starts with Susanna Martinez.
The first thing I would do is remove the Pit Rule 17, the amendment that allows for, or requires actually, the removal of the mud, et cetera, that is drilled or pulled up from the earth when you're drilling a well. That costs the oil and gas industry about $200,000 to $250,000 per well in order to haul that off to a business that is owned by a good friend of our governor. And I do strongly believe that it is unnecessary. It is not environmentally required. In fact, there were hearings held with an awful lot of detail. We over-regulate. I'm on record having said that's the first thing we would do. It was by executive order that law came in, that regulation came in, not through the legislature. That's how the current administration does business, in the reverse.
Thank you. Janice Arnold-Jones.
Well, a couple of things. Actually, the pit rule is by regulation, and so there are 3 actions that I would take immediately. The first one, I would issue a moratorium because it is regulatory. You don't get to rescind it. The second thing is I would prepare legislation immediately to take the legislative action to rescind it. And the third thing is I would ask my most able AG over there to take it to court. But that's not the whole story. What we have done to our oil and gas industry is absolutely criminal. And now the confluence of activities, when I tell you that New York, Pennsylvania, and Alabama are producing natural gas at $1.35, and the best we can do in our state is $2.75 for natural gas, it means that we are now in a competitive market and we may not be able to pull it back. This breaks my heart. And let me tell you how critical that is. 20 to 30% of our budget comes from oil and natural gas is the greater producer. So we are now at the point of looking at, and I would recommend, a reduction in severance tax. Our oil and gas industry has carried this state. It is time for relief, and I know severance tax is a sacred cow. It's time for relief.
There's actually already a case in court. The New Mexico Oil and Gas Association has filed a case to deal with the pit rule. It's moving very slowly, but I think all the candidates running for governor agree that we have to do something about the pit rule. We have a third fewer, or 2/3 fewer rigs in the field today than we did 18 months ago, which is significant. Not so much significant because the price of oil and gas is lower, but because when the price of oil and gas goes higher, we will not actually have the wells drilled to start producing again. So on top of dealing with the pit rule, what I would suggest is a solution that was done in Canada in the mid-'80s when the bottom fell out of the oil market, and that is to induce producers who are now investing in Spain, in the Powder River Basin, in the Marcellus shales on the east coast, to start drilling again by eliminating for a year or two the revenues that they would ultimately pay to the state as an incentive to get their guys back in the field and start drilling again. You go up to Farmington, you go down to southeast New Mexico, and the field services guys are the ones who are really, really hurting. The producers and the guys who own the properties, they can go to Texas, they go to Wyoming, they can go to Spain, they can go anywhere else. But it's those guys who need the help. So we have to incentivize them to get back in the field and get these people back to work. And so when the price does go up, we will have the wells to start producing again.
Okay. And I believe we're starting with you, Doug. Okay. How do you feel about the war on drugs and the proposal to legalize drugs?
Well, first
I'm
off,
assuming that means legalize marijuana.
not all drugs.
Probably not, but you can address it.
I don't support legalization of drugs. But clearly the war on drugs in this country has not been a success. And I think that we have to be honest and look at, at whatever options are thrown on the table. I mean, I'm not an advocate of legalization, but I am aware, as are we all, and certainly people who fight crime that's drug-related and murders and all sorts of terrible things that are going on, which is what I think this murder in Arizona was actually drug-related, that we've got to do something about it, and we've got to do something that actually works. And I think an honest discussion and acknowledgement that our war on drugs is failing is the first place that we have to start.
Susanna Martinez.
As the chief law enforcement officer in my county, we have certainly been fighting the war on drugs for a very long time. I do not support the legalization of any of the drugs. I'm in the front line. I have seen what, starting on marijuana, what the different types of what we call recreational drugs may lead you to. And we have seen it time and time again, from going from marijuana to a stronger drug to a stronger drug. We have got to keep up the fight. I spoke out against this 10 years ago at a Republican convention when there was talk about legalizing marijuana, cocaine, and heroin. The answer is no, we cannot do that. There is a misperception that we have a lot of people who use minor drugs and are in prison. That is not true. In fact, rehabilitation is the #1 point of view for sentencing on your first offense. Now, we're not talking trafficking drugs, we're talking simple possession of drugs. We do not put people in prison or jail for minor possession of drugs. Rehabilitation is the first thing that is looked at. However, repeat offenders, people who move up in the level of their activity, criminal activity, then yes, eventually prison will be your sentence. We have got to continue the war on drugs because that violence is coming across. It is our responsibility to stop being so hungry for the narcotics that brings those drugs to the United States. As citizens, we've got to fight the war on drugs, person by person, individual by individual, so that we don't have that demand in our country.
Thank you. Janice Arnold-Jones.
Clearly, we have not framed the war on drugs in a way that we can win it. You know, as a legislator, you do get to do some professional development, and I was privileged to sit with the AG of Chihuahua, who looked at me and literally had his finger in my chest, and he says, so what are you going to do to stop the use of drugs in your country, because you're killing my country. You have the money to buy the drugs, and we're going to send it to you, and they're killing my people. He was right. He was right. And so what do we do? Well, since I've served in the legislature, we did pass the medical marijuana law, and I'm really troubled because, you know, I understand pain, I do, but when I look at the numbers of who is using medical marijuana, the largest diagnosis of users is PTSD. Boy, is that a broad diagnosis. And I do agree that it is a gateway drug. And so when I look at the impact on our state, and I look at the way that illegal drugs and the war on drugs is traveling up our state. You go to Lordsburg and it's meth, you go to Silver City and it's cocaine, you go to Espanola and it's heroin. It affects my business. I hire people in Los Alamos for the work that we do, and I can't keep them because they cannot pass the drug test. We have got to look at drugs in a different way, but we have to stop the desire for it. And I don't think we've even had that discussion. I think that's a good term.
Be the final question before closings. This will be the question for Susanna Martinez. Can you state your position on either driver's license for illegals or your feelings on voter ID and same-day registration?
I oppose same-day registration. I support photo ID for voting, and I oppose driver's licenses for illegal immigrants, period.
Thank you. Janice Arnold-Jones.
I oppose both of them, but let me tell you the rest of the story. When driver's licenses for illegals was argued on the floor, I want you to know that the argument was that if we provided driver's licenses to illegals, that they would buy insurance. On the same-day voter registration laws, you know, and it's really funny to sit on these committees and to hear this argument day in and day out. And so, no, I don't support same-day voter registration. And by the way, the bill this year was same-day voter registration and early voting. You need to be precise what that means. We actually could have done that because we had the systems, but otherwise we don't have the systems. But here's the argument every time. What would happen if if the TF drove all the way from the chapter house and drove all the way to the polling station and didn't have their driver's license, that wouldn't be good, would it? Just think about what I said. And so the concept of one person, one vote is actually something that's a little bit foreign here, but it is a bigger problem. I want you to think larger. I know you all think that if you move from this state to another state, that there is a requirement that the first Secretary of State expunge your voting record in another state. That is not so. This is a federal issue, and it is time to get serious about it. And until we get to that point, you will still be able to vote in New Mexico, and sadly in Texas, and thank goodness we have DAs who are willing to watch it. It's not legal, but the system is in our way.
I'm totally opposed to same-day registration. I am opposed to providing driver's licenses to illegals. And I do think that we should have a requirement to show IDs when people go and vote. What kind of state are we living in where we're giving illegal aliens legal licenses, basically, legal IDs, and yet our own citizens are not even required to show their IDs when they vote? I mean, we have a campaign dog that got a credit card, a real one. I mean, how crazy is that? I mean, we have to stop this practice. You know, the other practice that we have to stop is this whole sanctuary concept that we have in New Mexico. And if you have an ID, our state police officers are not even required to ask if they are legal in this state or not, or in this country. You know, a couple years ago, I chased a guy down who broke into my car on the street. I chased him down 2 blocks, tackled him in the road, and held him down until the police showed up. And he was a Mexican guy, didn't speak any English. And the cops showed up and they said, "What do you want to do with him?" After calling me crazy. And I said, "I want to prosecute." They said, "What's the point? The city's going to turn him over to the INS. They're going to ship him back to Mexico, and he'll be back in your neighborhood next week." That practice has to stop.